Mouthwashing is widely considered to be one of the best indie horror games to come out in the last year, being rated overwhelmingly positive on Steam and being nominated for Game of the Year. With its distinct visual style reminiscent of the classic PS1 era of horror games, stellar audio design, and evocative hard-hitting writing, it's clear why this game is so universally praised, not only by players, but also YouTube video essayists, heralding the game as a masterpiece of psychological horror. So imagine my surprise when I played the game for myself and found, well, shit. A mascot horror game. I played the demo for Mouthwashing when it originally came out, and I was very impressed by it. I'm a sucker for the stylized, low-poly art style that's become a mainstay of modern horror games and content in general, so getting to go through the demo was a lot of fun for me. The demo consists of an older version of the intro sequence of Mouthwashing, where we are introduced to our lovable cast of characters. Anya, the sensitive and soft-spoken nurse, Swansea, the rugged and experienced mechanic and former sober family man, Daisuke, the unpaid intern, Captain Curly, the accomplished captain of the Tulpar who's currently bedridden, and Jimmy, the co-pilot, who just so happens to be a big fan of P. Diddy, Drake, R. Kelly, and Bill Cosby for some reason. Our crew, originally tasked with piloting the Tulpar freighter ship for the interstellar shipping company Polle Express, has ended up stranded in the void of space for reasons, and now, surviving off of dwindling resources, have no choice but to break into the ship's cargo and loot it for supplies, hoping that it contains something that can help with their survival. Of course, upon opening the cargo, the crew is horrified to discover the entire purpose of their months-long trip through space was for nothing more than shipping thousands of bottles of mouthwash. The crew is doomed, and before their food, water, or oxygen runs out, all but one of them will be dead. With a premise straight out of r/2 sentence horror in a striking visual style, I and the rest of the internet were instantly hooked, and I waited patiently for the game's full release. Nearing the end of 2024, I found out the full game had come out, not from a release trailer, but from hundreds of people praising the game as a masterpiece across the internet. Even Corey X Kenshin, a beloved YouTuber who had just returned from an extended hiatus on YouTube, one of the first games he played when he came back was Mouthwashing. Between all of that and the overwhelmingly positive rating on Steam, I knew this game was going to be quite the experience, and I was really looking forward to playing it. In fact, I was so hyped to play it that I decided to stream the game for my first ever live stream of 2025. It's a level fun reference! Yeah! Jimbo! I don't know why I chose to crash the whole plane. That wasn't scary. I'm really not sure where I'm supposed to go, honestly. I think this just loops forever. Shit. I didn't like it. Mouthwashing, even accounting for everything it does really well, is a really overrated game, with massive issues in its gameplay, story, replayability, visuals, artistic choices, and frankly, a lot of Mouthwashing's flaws are literally shared with some of the most infamously hated contemporary horror games. So, before I explain why and get thrown into a Fallout 4 cryogenic chamber for what I'm about to say, I'd like to give one last spoiler warning and content warning. We are going to be talking about everything in Mouthwashing. So, if you're interested in experiencing the game for yourself, now's your chance to see yourself out. Huge, serious content warning for the following listed on screen now. I mean this very seriously, shit gets dark quick. With all that out of the way, let's begin. Now, I'm going to assume if you're watching this video, you probably already played or at least know the story of Mouthwashing, but if you need a refresher or chose to ignore the previous spoiler warning, I'll bring you all up to speed. As mentioned, the Polle Express is an intergalactic shipping company, implying that the world of Mouthwashing is one advanced enough where humanity has seemingly conquered the stars, and has upscaled simple processes like shipping vehicles into interplanetary travels. In Mouthwashing, we play as Jimmy, the Tulpar's second-in-command. Though sometimes in flashbacks, which we'll get to later, we also play as the captain, Captain Curly. The first moments of the game show who is presumably Captain Curly actively sabotaging the Tulpar's navigation systems, crashing the ship into a nearby asteroid, sending their ship off course, and marooning it on a tiny floating rock in the void of space. The ship being sabotaged here is actually a reference to the video game Among Us, a multiplayer social deduction game where the ship sustains catastrophic damage, with special sci-fi foam being released from the walls of the ship and filling all the gaps that the crash caused, which also notably blocks off most of the ship's vital resources. And while the foam itself is easy enough to break through, doing so risks poking a hole in the ship and causing rapid decompression, basically what happened to the Titan submarine. The game truly begins in the aftermath of the crash, and things aren't looking so good for the crew, and especially not for the ship's captain, Curly. While all 5 crew members survived, Curly seemed to take the brunt of the impact, being severely injured and mutilated in the crash. His skin seems to be burned entirely off, he only has one eye left, and his hands and feet are gone. Jimmy, our player character, accuses Curly of staging the crash himself, causing a level of disdain to the captain for basically dooming everyone on the ship to a slow death. At that point, any one of them could have justified killing Captain Curly, either out of revenge or mercy, given how much agony he's in. But for whatever reasons, the crew collectively decided to keep him alive. The once accomplished and respected captain, now reduced to a half-dead corpse writhing in pain in the ship's medical bay, only kept sane by an increasingly dwindling supply of painkillers, is now out of commission, not even able to speak. This results in the co-pilot Jimmy declaring himself to be captain. 2 months after the crash, food and medical supplies are running low, and the crew are growing restless and desperate. They realize that the ship's cargo is full of, well, something, and though in their contracts with Pony Express they are expressly not allowed to open the cargo and mess with its contents, they're all dying and hopeless. And though Swansea isn't exactly a fan of their paychecks being docked for messing with the delivery, the crew ultimately decides to break inside the cargo. Maybe it'll contain food, snacks, water, medical supplies, something, anything that could be of use and prolong their survival. And so the crew, hopeful and standing behind Jimmy and putting the access code, waits eagerly as the massive metal doors slide open, revealing the interior of the cargo hold, a massive warehouse-like environment full of metal shelves and boxes. But before we find out exactly what these are boxes of, we cut to a flashback. This game showcases its narrative in a purposefully disjointed way, revealing information out of order to explain context and foreshadow future events. A week before the crash, our perspective shifts to that of Captain Curly, who is taking a psychological examination with the ship's onboard nurse, Anya. Having just completed Curly's psych eval, she, for some reason, isn't exactly looking forward to finishing the job and performing the last examination on the last crew member, Jimmy. So Captain Curly elects to do it for her. On his way to the co-pilot, Captain Curly assists a trapped Daisuke and a very annoyed Swansea. Minor damage to the ship's hull resulted in foam expansion we saw earlier, later I guess, encasing poor Daisuke. After rescuing Daisuke with the emergency fire axe and giving Swansea a gentle yet firm reprimanding, the captain continues to the cockpit to talk with Jimmy. As he makes it over to the cockpit though, we're shown a trippy hallucinatory sequence. Ladders and glowing warning signs rise from the crimson ocean as Curly walks through this flat open plain, before eventually his vision is enveloped by a sun. Cutting back to the cockpit, we witness the last bit of Jimmy's psych eval. This moment is probably where we get the most honest view of who Jimmy and Curly are as people. Curly asks Jimmy how he's feeling, low-key, promising not to write it down in a psych eval. Jimmy explains that he enjoys the feeling of being in control and is jealous about how much praise and admiration the prestigious Captain Curly gets all the time. But Curly doesn't seem to see it in that way, as he contemplates his career as a captain for the Pony Express. He knows he's a great captain, but at the same time, that praise and admiration, as nice as it is, also is kind of worrying. He feels trapped, being so good at his job, and questioning if this is what really makes him happy. If maybe he should pursue something else in his life, not wanting to live life he's constantly running away from. Jimmy compares his worries to reaching the top of a tall ladder, only to realize that maybe he was climbing the wrong ladder all along, seemingly empathizing with and understanding Curly's troubles. I'm glad that the game decided to instantly explain exactly what the ladders he represented, but anyway, Curly suddenly gets an important message from corporate. But what exactly this message says, we'll find out later. We cut back to the rest of the Toplar crew in the present, where, after being shown a commercial on a TV and another hallucination sequence, we quickly realize what the crew found inside that cargo hold. They were praying the cargo hold supplies could save them, but to their horror, the only thing they found inside was mouthwash. It's about 13% alcohol, and its sugar content makes it useless as a disinfectant. And the harsh chemicals likely won't make it a very stable or healthy source of sustenance. Swansea, a recovering alcoholic, seemingly nearing the ending of his life, says fuck it and starts downing the stuff to get drunk, and ends his 15-year-long sobriety streak. As you could probably guess, morale is only getting worse by the minute on the ship, which isn't helped by the half-dead man writhing in pain in the medical bay at all hours of the day. Anya, the ship's nurse, would usually be in charge of giving Curly his painkillers, but she just can't bring herself to do it. Maybe his guttural cries of pain are just too cringe-inducing for her to handle, or maybe it's just something about forcing someone to take drugs against their will. Jimmy, feeling weirdly pissy about Anya asking him to give him the pills, makes him start to baby rage about all the responsibility being put on him, despite literally making himself the captain. He stomps into the medical bay where he forces Curly to take the painkillers and has an audibly painful struggle with him, which cuts to another hallucination sequence where he kills him with an axe. 6 days before the crash, Captain Curly is forced to, quote, break the news to the rest of the crew. Though before he can reveal what's going on to his crewmates, Curly is surprised with a birthday party. Of course, the celebration is cut short once they sit down to enjoy their yummy cake. Jimmy asks if Curly is okay, to which he reveals the message he received from corporate. The Pony Express shipping company is going out of business, and this will be the crew's final job together. And everyone is quite upset at the news. Anya doesn't have any savings and will be out of a job when she returns home. Daisuke is an unpaid intern with rich parents, but even he's sad to say goodbye to his friends. Swansea, while disappointed, doesn't really seem surprised at this news, as shipping vessels being manned by actual humans has become quite rare, as more and more companies opt for AI-run ships. The Pony Express is characterized as a very shady and cheap company, willing to cut corners to save a few pennies, at the expense of their ship's quality and crew's safety, which may be part of the reason why they opted for man-run ships. Curly admits they knew about this news for a while and was told by corporate to only tell the rest of the crew once they're close to the landing, but he didn't think it was fair to drop the ball on them so late. Jimmy takes the news the hardest, spitting the blame on Curly for, quote, finally getting exactly what he wanted, without all the guilt, being able to quit his job and go on to do bigger and better things, leaving the rest of the crew behind, without being forced to make the actual decision to quit. It should be noted, of course, that Pony Express going out of business is literally not Curly's fault, and that Jimmy's reaction and instinct to blame Curly for this is completely irrational. We then skip ahead to 4 months after the crash. Daisuke alerts Jimmy that Anya has trapped herself inside the medical bay with Captain Curly. Jimmy is terrified that Anya is about to kill Curly, so he hatches a plan with Daisuke to get inside the med bay and try to save him. The plan is to spike Swansea's drink. What? Yeah, since Swansea won't let anyone to the utility room, he plans to spike his drink with the last bottle of rubbing alcohol. This way, they can get into utility and use the vent to send Daisuke through into the medical bay, in reference to the video game Among Us, a multiplayer social deduction game. However, upon getting into utility, the two realize that Swansea was apparently lying about the entire room being foamed over. It's actually one of the less damaged areas, and the apparent reason he was hiding it was to save the ship's last functional cryopod for himself. Jimmy manipulates Daisuke into crawling through the vents, and while he does manage to get the medical bay door open, the vent system was extremely damaged during the crash, and crawling through torn apart narrow metal crevices is generally not good for your health. Daisuke emerged from the vent sustaining serious injuries, being in abject agony in the end. Jimmy tries to disinfect his wounds, but there's no rubbing alcohol left. He used the last of it to spike Swansea's drink. All that's left is the mouthwash, and well, high sugar content makes it useless as an antiseptic, which makes his pain even worse. Swansea, coming to, puts Daisuke out of his misery, lamenting that though he was kind of stupid and useless on the ship, he really was just a kid trying his best to make his mom proud. In the medical bay, Jimmy discovers that Anya is dead. She overdosed on painkillers and committed suicide. Curly was never in any danger, and Jimmy failed to even once consider the safety or well-being of anyone but him. He ends up discovering the ship's revolver hidden in Curly's bed, and as he grabs it and Curly laughs maniacally, Swansea goes after Jimmy with the axe. We cut to another flashback where Curly is trying to find the ship's gun, which only the captain is supposed to have access to in case of an emergency. Curly goes to Anya, who reveals that she was the one who hid the gun, and it's here that we learn why. Anya is pregnant. It is heavily implied here that Jimmy raped her. Anya is terrified that Jimmy would retaliate in some way if Anya told the truth, and so she hid the gun to make sure that Jimmy couldn't do anything with it if push came to shove. Of course, we know this plan would ultimately fail, as we already saw Jimmy grab the gun after Anya's overdose. Later in the flashback, we see Curly confront Jimmy for raping Anya. Throughout the game, we are shown that Curly and Jimmy are really good friends who have apparently known each other for quite a long time. And in fact, that Curly is really one of the only people that Jimmy actually gives a shit about. So Curly probably assumed that if anyone could convince Jimmy to take responsibility for his actions, it would be him, but this doesn't go as planned. Jimmy basically blackmails Curly. He states that if he agreed to what Curly is asking of him to turn himself in and take accountability, Curly, and seemingly the rest of the crew, are gonna go down with him. The Pony Express company seems to dock payment and punish detractors collectively, which is made evident by all the posters around the ship, highlighting the importance of team synergy and saying, yeah, if one person fucks up, everyone gets punished. And if the truth about what happened on the toll park gets out there, Jimmy argues, Curly and the rest of the crew will be held responsible for it. And so, Curly does nothing. He lets him off the hook, seemingly understanding and agreeing with what Jimmy is saying. However, even with Jimmy getting basically a get-out-of-jail-free card for his heinous crimes, the guilt, or perhaps just the understanding that he still may face consequences, becomes too much for him to bear. And even if he gets back home and gets away with his crime, what great life is he exactly going back to? He's poor, he spends his time lifting weights and doing drugs, and is about to lose his job regardless of if he's caught or not. He's already lost everything. And so, Jimmy chooses the easy way out. It's revealed that Jimmy, not Captain Curly, Jimmy, was the one who crashed the Tulpar. He intended to kill himself and all the rest of the crew. Maybe in his twisted mind this was truly the best outcome for everyone. Anya, if he had any remorse or care for her, wouldn't have to deal with the trauma of his rape and unwanted pregnancy. And Curly wouldn't have to deal with the loss of his reputation. And of course, with Jimmy's narcissism, he wouldn't have to face the consequences of his actions, which is probably what he cared about most, let's be real. But even though Curly basically allowed Jimmy to get to this point, as it turns out, even he thought this was too far. And in his attempt to stop the crash and save the crew, Curly sustained the brunt of it, leading to his current severely mutilated state. Jimmy lied to the rest of the crew, blaming the crash on Curly when in reality, everything that happened on the Tulpar was caused by him. Back in the present day, outside the hallucinations, Jimmy struggles with Swansea before he eventually subdues him and ties him to a chair. Before Jimmy shoots Swansea, he monologues. He talks about his time as a drunk degenerate, only ever worrying about where his next drink would come from, until one day he's scared straight by a vision that he has of a bloated, drunken corpse lying dead in a ditch. And so, he tries to fix his life. He gets a job, gets married, has children, and seemingly lives an ideal, perfect life. But as he broke his sobriety and went back to drinking, in the case of the tons of mouthwash on board, he realized something. That the best time of his life wasn't with his family or with his job, but when he was a drinker. Swansea basically compares himself to Jimmy here, a fellow degenerate, someone who gets power and pleasure out of sexually assaulting women and doing drugs. And Swansea is ultimately able to admit to his faults, admit that he's kind of a piece of shit, and yet, that's more than Jimmy could ever do. He can admit to being a horrible person, but Jimmy can't. He can't admit to being a horrible person. He can't ever truly take responsibility. And Swansea only ever regrets not being able to save Daisuke, revealing that the cryopod he saved was actually meant for him. And with that, Jimmy, the cowardly, selfish person he is, shoots Swansea, ending his life and rendering himself and Curly as the only survivors. And naturally, to celebrate that fact, Jimmy holds a birthday party with Curly where he eats human flesh. Insert partygoer reference here. After the celebrations, Jimmy goes through some Silent Hill-esque hallucination sequences, where he is confronted by visions of crazy, fucked up horse monstrosities, before he is eventually confronted by the final boss of Mouthwashing, Polle himself, the cartoon horse and mascot of the Pony Express. He was behind it all. Oh, no, wait, that was Jimmy, I'm sorry. I mean, they look so similar, can you really blame me? This hallucinatory avatar of Polle mocks Jimmy for being unable to take responsibility for his actions. Perhaps this is meant to show that deep down, Jimmy does feel some sort of remorse for his actions, if his subconscious is showing him these visions. But how he feels here obviously doesn't really matter, because Jimmy has, raped someone and killed everyone. We don't care if he feels bad here. But more importantly, Jimmy has deluded himself into believing that all he has to do to redeem himself is save Curly, the only person he's ever cared about. And so, that's what he does. He picks up Curly and takes him to the cryogenic chamber that Swansea tried to save for Daisuke. As Jimmy places Curly into the cryogenic chamber, he apologizes for everything that happened, though not caring about all the people he's hurt and killed, and only caring about Curly, feeling remorse for hurting him, the only person he ever really saw as human. Giving his goodbyes and final words to his captain and best friend, Jimmy steps aside and turns on the cryopod, before turning the revolver on himself and ending his own life. In the end, Jimmy truly did win. He got everything he wanted in his sick, deluded way. He got away with his horrific crimes against Anya, avoided facing the consequences for his actions, and, in his mind, saved his best friend Curly. And as the credits roll and Curly's cryopod begins filling with cold air, he's guaranteed at least 20 more years of life. Though, with Curly Express going out of business, it's unclear if anyone will go out and try to save him. And even if he is rescued in his horrifically mutilated state, it wouldn't be surprising if Curly surviving and being the sole survivor of the Tulpar is perhaps the worst fate imaginable for the captain. And with that, that is the story of Mouthwashing. Mouthwashing is a deeply moving and impactful game, and very clearly the developers at Wrong Oregon knew what they were doing. And I want to highlight exactly why this game means so much to me personally and where this game excels. But before we get into the obvious reasons why everyone and their grandmother loves this game, I want to take the time to talk about the other parts of the game that were done really well. To begin, the audio design. Holy shit, the audio design. If you ever meet someone that thinks that audio design is not important when it comes to video games, make them play Mouthwashing. Between the ambience of the ship itself, the low hum of distant machinery, the echo of the footsteps on industrial flooring, all the way to the beeps and boops of the cockpit and the machinery present within the Toplar. Every little sound effect will make you feel like you are seriously trapped in a spaceship floating in the void of space. And Mouthwashing is one of those games where basically every part of it is iconic enough that you will recognize it outside the game. Like, if you've played through the game and outside of it you hear the button input sound or the happy birthday jingle, you will just be instantly sent back to the ship like you're trapped in your own guilt-induced hallucination. The sound design of Mouthwashing perfectly blends together the fantastical elements of sci-fi technology with the grimy, realistic look and feel of cheap machinery. It puts you in that mindset of, yeah, I'm working a shitty job with awful equipment that could fail me at any moment. And to add on to that point about the audio design, the music. The music is so good. Like, I don't ever see people talking about music at all. And to be frank, that may be a good thing. There are some games where the music is just bumping as hell, and you know the soundtrack's gonna get like every single reward for it, but for Mouthwashing, I honestly completely forgot there was music even playing the whole time. The music blended in so perfectly with the game that I never thought to consider I was listening to it until my playthrough ended. Going back to listen to the soundtrack for making this video, god, it feels like watching a video of yourself tweaking after a bad trip. You're just instantly pulled back into that dark void as the beautiful harmonies that remind you of the beauty of space crash together with the distorted drums and electrical moans, like an auditory version of metal scraping against flesh. If I had to make a comparison, it's like a mix of the Silent Hill 2 soundtrack and the Portal 2 soundtrack. Mouthwashing's music was composed by Martin Halden, who has done other work on games released by Wrong Oregon, and he knocked it out of the park. Of course, the thing that first drew me into Mouthwashing was its visual style. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this game has a really defined art style in its graphics, and I absolutely adore it. It perfectly blends that outdated but beloved nostalgic look of the old PS1 era games, combined with a more cartoony and stylized look that feels more modern than most modern games. It reminds me a lot of Lilith Walther's work, a YouTube animator and game dev who you probably know from Nightmare Cart and the Bloodborne PS1 remake. I was honestly shocked when I found out she wasn't involved with Mouthwashing, because they both do such a good job bringing these characters in this world to life in a way that's both visually appealing while also being gritty and realistic when it needs to be. I could go on obviously, but you know, the reason you're watching this video right now is because of the main thing this game does great, and that's its story. Mouthwashing's story alone is one of the most painfully realistic depictions of an abusive dynamic I've ever seen in media, let alone in a video game. The world that we see depicted in Mouthwashing is one that I think is really interesting, and serves to perfectly illustrate that futuristic yet hopeless society our characters are forced to deal with. I don't know if it was Iron Lung or Lethal Company that started the trend of hopeless capitalist dystopias in space, but I'm really glad they did, because Mouthwashing perfectly fits in this new emerging trope. As we went over earlier, this world seemingly takes place in the future, or at the very least a retro-futuristic take on 1970s America. The perfect setting for an evil corporate takeover of the stars. And all the pain caused by the faceless executives of Pony Express is summed up in a single being that taunts us through the entirety of Mouthwashing: Polle. We will talk about Polle later. So much of this game's success boils down to its characters, each one being iconic and beloved in their own right. Yes, even Jimmy, and yes, even the horse. They're all extremely well-written characters, all of them having their own dynamics and iconic lines. From Swansea and Daisuke's fatherly relationship, to Curly and Jimmy's bromance gone wrong on clickbait must-see, to the subtle power play and manipulation we see between Jimmy and Anya and Daisuke. The story that unfolds in the Toplar is shockingly realistic. Despite the somewhat fantastical and surreal moments of crazy hallucinations and horse shenanigans, Mouthwashing at its core is a game about abuse, how it can happen, and how people get away with it, both in an abusive work environment and interpersonal abuse. We're shown this very clearly through Jimmy's actions. He's characterized as a textbook narcissist who values being in control and is jealous of others who are seemingly above him, either in some official capacity like him being a co-pilot to the Captain Curly, or in status in general, like as it's implied that Jimmy didn't have a lot of money back on Earth. The abuse and desire for power is shown, albeit more indirectly, through the rules enforced on its workers by Pony Express, the shipping company. No company is as heartless in the world of mouthwashing as Pony Express, who are strongly characterized from the beginning as an evil company, willing to dose out collective punishment, sleep deprivation, and worst of all, unpaid internships, all in the name of making those sweet, sweet V-Bucks. When you combine a company who doesn't give a shit if its workers are harmed or even killed for the sake of making a profit, with an abusive narcissist like Jimmy, you get a perfect storm, which leads perfectly to the situation we see in Mouthwashing. Jimmy, an abusive narcissistic rapist, is basically given the perfect environment to prey on any victim he wants through the inadequate safety measures enforced by Pony Express, who built a ship with no locks on the sweeping quarters, is willing to hire young and inexperienced and immature workers, and gives out collective punishment. So even if Jimmy raping his crewmate is against the rules of Pony Express on paper, if Anya or Curly tried to report Jimmy, they would all suffer for it. Mouthwashing is making a statement that both of these forms of abuse are intertwined with one another inherently. These power imbalances built on selfish desires for more power, whether it's in a twisted sexual satisfaction, or having power over another person, or gaining the system to get further capital, and being willing to do anything to make the line go up, coalesce with another under a capitalist system. Jimmy was seemingly always a terrible person, whose nature or nurture led him down this dark path for a very long time. And though I'm not going to say he wouldn't commit such horrific crimes if he never stepped foot aboard the Tulpar, I would be willing to bet that he wouldn't be as likely to assault someone in broad daylight, where there's at least the veil of a threat of consequences with tons of people around or potential law enforcement. By being on the Tulpar with this evil company, Jimmy was basically guaranteed to do this. One of the most realistic and painful parts of the story of Mouthwashing is Curly, because while Curly is undeniably a fan favorite in the Mouthwashing fandom, he's undeniably part of the reason why Anya ended up being abused and why Jimmy got away with it. He's shown to be a generally good person who's willing to stick his neck out for a crew even if it means bending the rules enforced by Pony Express. But it's ultimately his inaction and unwillingness to see his friend Jimmy for who he really is that ends up getting Anya hurt. But as we've gone over before, you can't really blame him too hard for being a bystander in the situation, because with the way that Pony Express operates, if Jimmy goes down, everyone goes down. I honestly think that this is one of the best pieces of media to cover such serious topics like rape and workplace abuse. There are a lot of movies and shows and media in general that don't really have the time, maturity, or knowledge of these serious topics to cover them with grace and subtlety, and often resort to using them for shock value. While I do think Mouthwashing also does this to an extent, which I will touch on later, I think the game honestly did the best it could do. The subtle and mindful reveal that yes, Anya was raped and Jimmy was the one who did it was done in a really effective way. Of course, it's important to note that Mouthwashing isn't really a story about Anya, despite her being the main victim of Jimmy's actions, because Mouthwashing's protagonist is Jimmy, sometimes Curly, and is mainly focused on his feelings about what happened on the Tulpar. This was something I initially wasn't really a fan of, because a lot of pieces of media have this issue where the abuse is the main or one of the main issues of the story, but the narrative is far more focused on the abuser rather than the victim. And in the story's attempt to explore the mind of a crazed lunatic, the victim ends up being inadvertently silenced. But while I do think this is an inherent issue with media that attempts to take a nuanced look into stories of sexual abuse, I've personally grown to accept the way that's done in Mouthwashing's case. Because unlike other media where this happens, where the story is ostensibly from the abuser's point of view and doesn't really take care to explore the victim's side of things, Mouthwashing actually takes advantage of this trope by using it to specifically show how little the victim matters to the abuser. As in Jimmy's hallucination sequences, Anya is never there. She's shown as just a womb, not even a person in Jimmy's eyes, just a fleshly vessel housing Jimmy's unborn child and nothing more. And by using the narrative in this way, Mouthwashing shows that it has no issues with putting the blame on Jimmy for his horrific acts, and showing precisely just how much of a piece of shit he is. So yeah, Mouthwashing has one of the best stories to come out of any indie game we've seen in a while. 10 out of 10, no notes, this game has no issues whatsoever. Oh, also, I really liked how the medbay on the Tulpar had a lock on it, which is actually a reference to the video game Among Us, a multiplayer social deduction game. So, with all the praise I've just given to the game, you might be confused as to why I'm making this video at all. Like, I've spent the past X minutes glazing the game, but this video's thumbnail plainly says overrated, like what the fuck? And while a lot of what I've praised the game for are things that most other people have said already, this game also spoke to me personally. And as someone who's been abused in these kind of harmful power imbalance relationships before, I find Mouthwashing to be a deeply accurate depiction of this kind of abuse and trying to deal with it. Heck, I even consider myself to be a fan of Mouthwashing. I've personally engaged with a ton of fan-made content art and media based off this game. And yet, here I am making a video about Mouthwashing not being a good game. And if you're confused as to why that's the case, I completely understand. Because once I finished the game and the credits rolled, that's how I felt, confused. As the game ended, I was left awestruck. The amount of selfishness and suffering I had just witnessed, depicted in a way that was so realistic, really hit close to home. I didn't know what to say or even what to think after it. The story was undeniably fantastic, the characters well written, the visuals and audio is iconic, and yet, as the credits rolled and the names passed by on the screen, I was just kind of underwhelmed, unsatisfied. Like, I didn't like the game. Why? What the fuck? And that question is what led me to making this video, because it really took a while for me to wrap my head around what exactly about this game left me feeling this way. And what I came up with might be upsetting to a lot of people watching this video. Mouthwashing just isn't a good video game. The story is great, obviously. I just went over everything the game did well, but specifically as a video game, it's just not good. First, the game just isn't really fun. And I know that seems like a really stupid critique of the game for a game like Mouthwashing. Like, I'm obviously not expecting like a roller coaster to run around cranking 90s, but even games that are meant to be miserable often have mechanics that are actively enjoyable or at least somewhat entertaining to engage with. A great example of this is Pathologic, a game where you try to cure a disease ravaging a Victorian-era town. It's a cruel and unforgiving game that forces you to slowly walk through a dying town, slowly starve to death, and watch as your resources are slowly drained. But you still get to actually do stuff. Shoot people, solve puzzles, run from monsters, solve quests. It's still a video game. And it's the same for other kinds of infamously painful games like Lisa the Painful, Darkest Dungeon, Fear and Hunger. These are games that are specifically meant to be miserable and challenging to play through, and use their purposeful unfairness and punishment to really drive home their narratives and themes. I think that Mouthwashing was going for a similar thing here, where the only real interaction you have aside from talking to characters is just things like inputting codes, putting together meals out of gruel, picking up items, and walking from one side of the ship to another. Our characters are trapped together, and there really isn't much for them to do in-universe besides doing these really basic and menial things. And while that is understandable, at a certain point, I think the game just becomes boring and a slog to interact with. It doesn't really feel like that's the intended experience. It just feels like the game is unfinished and bare bones with content. And to me personally, that takes away from the experience in the story. I think the game's pacing is fine for what it is, but if it were up to me, I think it would be a lot cooler to have the game be longer and take place over the course of multiple in-game days, where you would do a bunch of chores on the ship like minor repairs, cleaning and cooking, stuff like that. And through each day you could interact with your crewmates and see how their mindset and morale is changing, and how it slowly declines over time as more horrible and horrible shit happens. You could still totally do the every day is the same and doing these tasks over and over is kind of grating type deal, but there would at least be a lot more stuff for the player to interact with and do in the game. There is nothing wrong with heavily narrative-based games, but when the story feels like the best part of the game and everything else feels pointless, actually playing Mouthwashing feels less like you're watching a movie or reading a book, and more like you're holding down the skip button on a visual novel trying to get to the good part. And once you've reached the end credits, that's it. This game really doesn't have much replay value unless you really like everything in it and are down to experience all over again the exact same. I mean, Mouthwashing's narrative makes heavy use of foreshadowing and allusion to the small details, and those are things you can't pick up on. And those are things you can pick up on a second playthrough, but I don't really consider that giving huge points for replay value. That's kind of the same for like every game, right? For a game like Mouthwashing, I don't know. I feel like the game having multiple endings or collectibles or more Easter eggs and side content would be kind of cool, just to flesh out the game a little more and reward players for going back again. This isn't a super important point because games don't need replay value, and using it as a crutch is something I'm personally not a fan of, but for a game that's a little over 2 hours and costs $13, I think it would be a nice touch. All of these issues are more things you'd probably be concerned with as a potential buyer of the game on Steam who wants to make sure they're getting their bang for their buck. But these are all issues that I can forgive as someone who mainly plays games for the story. But what I really can't forgive are the other issues I have with Mouthwashing. Mouthwashing isn't a good horror game. I'm not going to harp on this point for too long because frankly, I don't think it need to be a good horror game. You know, this is a heavily story-based psychological horror drama more than a Jeff the Killer Roblox Tycoon kind of deal. But it is marketed as a horror game. It has jump scares and horror themes, so I'm gonna judge it as such. It's just not scary, at least the parts that are seemingly trying to be horror. The game is full of, frankly, really lame horror cliches and horror game cliches. The most egregious example of this is the code scanner. This item sucks. Like, it's a black light you use to scan for text written in magic ink on the walls. It's such a basic concept for a horror game flashlight type item that, and the way it's used was incredibly obvious. Like, when you pick it up, I was instantly like, oh, it's gonna be one of those games. I have to scan every surface for Easter eggs. It's gonna be such a fucking slug. And I'm gonna talk more about the horse later, but there's a segment of this game that makes some use of the code scanner for horror. We get a sequence where we're trying to go through the cargo hold trying to find a single bottle of mouthwash, and we have to hide from the massive horse trying to kill us. But it's invisible and can only be seen by using the code scanner. Now, I honestly don't hate the concept of using the code scanner as a flashlight to see an invisible foe, but in practice, it might as well just be a normal flashlight. And frankly, you don't even really need the code scanner in this segment. It's easy to just go through the segment without using the flashlight because if you just slowly walk forward slowly enough, you'll inevitably get to the end unharmed. There's never a point where you have to use the code scanner or see the horse monster, so the entire segment is just a waste of an item. Now, these are all problems I have with the game when it comes to being a plain old horror game, and being a game in general, and yeah, that's my opinion, it's kind of bad in that regard, but when it comes to how the game plays when it comes to its psychological horror aspects, oh my god, it's so much worse. Like, I'm sorry if you feel the game is a masterpiece in psychological horror. I know that's basically the consensus of this game for most people. Like, I've seen a ton of videos where it's just called a psychological horror masterpiece. Like, did we play different games? Because the way people talk about this game made me think this game would be like a harrowing, suspenseful experience where you never know what's real, and it feels like you're on the brink of insanity and paranoia, looking around every corner expecting something to get you while walking through a broken world that doesn't make any sense and contains fragments of the truth, and instead, I got fake crashes, cheap jump scares, over-the-top body horror and mutilation, gravestones, eyeballs everywhere, walking through dark looping hallways, an evil birthday party. Is this what you people think peak looks like? This shit isn't fucking scary. None of this is scary. It's lame. I see this kind of shit all the time in Roblox games. It's not good. It's cliche. Like, I'm sorry. Maybe I'm just a jaded Gen Z who grew up with Jeff the Killer jump scares and shit, but like, this is really basic horror game. This is standard psychological horror. Now, I will acknowledge that based on the events in-game and the story, it does make sense why we're seeing all these eyeballs and stuff everywhere. The body horror and mutilation is shown because they're the injuries that Curly actually sustains in the crash. The eyeballs are from Curly's last remaining eyeball. The looping hallways are like Jimmy's conscious on a loop trying to justify his shit or something. The fake crashing, I don't know, it works as a scene transition. Maybe it's like a pun on the ship crashing, but we're not playing a video game in universe. It doesn't really make sense to be these kinds of meta jump scares. This is not DDLC. Like, it didn't need any of this. The game could have been just as, if not more scary and a better horror experience without all of these generic horror in-your-face jump scares plastered everywhere. The subject matter of the game is already scary enough. A group of people confined in an area in the void of space with dwindling supplies, a rapist on board, and the eventual reveal that said rapist was the cause of the entire crash and everyone's pain. The characters slowly realize their crewmate and friend they've spent over a year with is actually a monster. Not a big brute with claws and eyeballs, but a real monster. That's scary. That's really scary and a really dark and frankly realistic plot. So why the fuck did we need And you know what made me really realize that fact?
Polle says
Polle is the worst part of Mouthwashing by a long shot, because by including him in the game, the devs inadvertently turned Mouthwashing into a mascot horror game. This isn't a hot take, it's a fact. Mouthwashing is a mascot horror game. Look at Polle. Look at it! Oh, I'll give Mouthwashing one thing. It sure has guts, really, because I don't know of any other mascot horror game that had the guts to include allusions to abortion. Get that out of here! And don't get it twisted, I love mascot horror. Seriously, it's probably one of my favorite genres of horror. I mean, look at the partygoers. They're basically mascot horror anyway. My issue here isn't that Mouthwashing is a mascot horror game. What makes me upset is that, one, people treat Mouthwashing like it's a real horror game compared to mascot horror games, and that somehow it should be seen as inherently better even though they're both fucking mascot horror. And two, it does a horrible job at being mascot horror. So, in Mouthwashing, it's widely accepted that Polle, the mascot of the Pony Express company, is basically meant to be a stand-in and representation of Jimmy's unborn child. In many of the hallucination sequences, Polle is a stand-in for this child, being depicted as this grotesque monster that's chasing after Jimmy. As this child was born of rape, for Jimmy, the child functions as a literal representation of the consequences of his actions. This is most evident in the ultrasound hallucination sequence, where we're shown a screaming mound of living flesh that the player, Jimmy, has to scan with an ultrasound in order to try and find the baby. In this sequence being a literal horse fetus, we're shown here just how little Jimmy sees Anya as an actual person, as nothing more than a living womb housing his unborn child. This then leads to the confrontation between Jimmy and Polle at the end of the game, where Polle calls Jimmy old man, mockingly taking on a son role in the conversation. While in the context of the game's narrative, I can understand why this is the role Polle basically had to take on, I really don't see it as a good creative choice. While the ultrasound sequence does indirectly demonstrate that Jimmy doesn't see Anya as a person, in practice, this whole sequence doesn't really have a purpose of being here. Like, why would Jimmy be trying to perform an ultrasound on Anya? To what? To see if it's there? He should know it's there. He put it there. Idiot. Like, why are we doing this? It doesn't connect to anything shown in the game, and by this point, we already know that Anya is pregnant. It's just creepy visuals for the sake of creepy visuals. Like, yes, pregnancy horror is scary, but like, it has to at least have a purpose behind it. And why is Polle a big, long centipede monster in the vents here? What does he represent here? The pregnancy? Daisuke being trapped in the vents and being mangled up? Maybe, but like, even if there's actual meaning behind this sequence, it still feels really pointless because it's just taking a normal horse and turning it into a mascot horror nightmare monster. It's just really cliche and not scary. The only half-decent use of Polle when it comes to being a monster is the part where you use the code scanner as a flashlight and have to quietly move your way through the cargo hold, as mentioned previously. But even in this sequence, we're just being chased by a pretty normal horse monster. Not Polle, just a normal horse monster. It doesn't even make use of Polle at all. The way that I interpreted the sequence, and probably a lot of people interpret it as well, is that we're being forced to be quiet here because it's a parallel to how Jimmy feels he has to hide his crimes from the rest of the world, as well as how Anya was forced to remain silent during and about her rape. But if the horse is meant to be a stand-in for Jimmy's unborn child, why would the child, or Jimmy's mental image of the child, be the one he has to keep quiet from? It's just to keep quiet about the responsibility of it. It feels like kind of a stretch. There's already an instance of characters being forced to be quiet lest they be put in danger, so the danger of there being a horse, it just kind of doesn't make a narrative sense to me. Polle, as a mascot, should represent the evil and neglectful, selfish nature of the Pony Express, and how their bad choices led to a situation where a rapist character is locked in a tiny ship with people for over a year. It should be used to show how little they care, which, to be fair, is something we do see alluded to in the game with the posters and the animatronic Polle in the lounge area. But for the most part, Polle is just a mascot that's corrupted and turns creepy and is used in place of Jimmy's unborn child in all the trippy hallucination sequences. All of the sequences that make use of Polle for horror, in all honesty, feel kind of tacked on and desperate. As if for some reason Wrong Organ thought that making the game mascot horror would make it more digestible for Gen Z audiences, which, if that's the case, it didn't work. No one ever talks about Polle. He's just the absolute worst part of this game. I fucking hate this horse. To me, he's the representation of everything this game does wrong when it comes to its psychological horror.
Aura, okay? That fucking horse that I hate.
That fucking horse. That I hate. That fucking
Horse.
that I hate.
That fucking
Horse
that I hate.
Now, by this point, if you haven't clicked off, You probably think that I completely despise mouthwashing and that I think it's bad all around, but the thing is, I wouldn't want to make a video about mouthwashing if it was just complete shit all the way through. Or if I did, I wouldn't bother going this in depth about it, because for everything that mouthwashing does really poorly, it does a lot really, really well. And I've already talked about everything I like about this game. I want to be really clear that the story of this game is really well done, and I love the characters in the world this game presents. That's why I'm so irritated at this game's flaws, because there really is a fantastic story beneath them all. I would like to highlight a specific part of mouthwashing that I believe shows exactly what this game does best, and what it frankly should have done more of. There is a scene near the end of the game where we are shown a conversation between Anya and Captain Curly. Oh. I'm gonna chop you into 20 fucking pieces! Okay, so I was supposed to use the rope. Oh, he got in. Okay, we're back to before the crash. You doing okay? Yeah, can't sleep. I know how it is. I just toss and turn, or stare at the ceiling all night. I actually kind of like the nighttime window screen, if you can believe it. So I just come and look at it sometimes. If you look really, really close, you can see there's a dead pixel in the upper right corner. That's so. Nope, don't see it. In the back of my mind, it's always there. In the back of my mind! Sorry. I'll go bonkers looking for it. Cheers. I don't think it ruins the illusion, though. It's peaceful. Maybe I'm just used to looking at the bigger picture. How many days of transfer do we have left? Let's see off the top of my head. Around 237 days. Just under 8 months. Hey, why do you think Pony Express put a lock on the medical room door, but not the sleeping quarters? I suppose for the same reason they put a lock on the cockpit. Safety. And the game froze again. Now, you may have noticed something about this particular moment in Mouthwashing that's kind of different from a lot of other parts of the game. It didn't have a massive red pulsating eyeball monster screaming at the top of your lungs for child support payments. Mouthwashing is a game that, in my opinion, fails to be a bloody, scary mascot horror, but knocks it out of the park when it comes to being a subtle, character-driven psychological horror drama. Because the best parts of Mouthwashing aren't the bloody, gory moments, screaming moments where you're like being chased by a monster and chopping someone's head off and eating human flesh at a birthday party. The best parts are the quiet, character-driven moments. The aforementioned dead pixel conversation between Anya and Curly. The reveal that Pony Express is going under and everyone's gonna lose their jobs. The final speech that Swansea gives to Jimmy before he shoots him. Jimmy's apology to a burning Curly in the void of space. These are the moments that make Mouthwashing what it is. And these moments are like totally outshined by bleh. In my mind, these are the parts of Mouthwashing that make the game playable. If it were up to me, if I was the creative director of Mouthwashing, I would have the game focus on these parts because, to be frank, bloody eyeballs in the walls and looping dark hallways and mascot horror horses will never be as scary as being forced to go to work every day with someone that assaulted you, and knowing that the management's not going to do anything about it. Mouthwashing should have been a slow, character-driven drama where we go through the entirety of the Kolpar's expedition across the stars, where we play minigames and make food and drinks, run routine checks on the ship, talk to our crewmates, fly the ship away from obstacles, and slowly get to know our crewmates over the course of many, many days. And through this, we slowly learn about the flaws of Jimmy and Curly as characters, which makes the eventual reveal of how monstrous Jimmy really is that much more impactful. And we could see firsthand the degradation of the ship and its crew. Maybe you could be playing as a different character, maybe Daisuke, or maybe you can see the perspectives of all the characters, like how we switched between Curly and Jimmy during the original game. And notice how none of what I just described needed funny horse monsters to be genuinely horrifying. Mouthwashing succeeded at telling a great story, but failed to be a good video game. It should have been a short film, maybe even an animated film in the style of a PS1 horror game. For me personally, I think an ideal Mouthwashing game is basically the same, but without these psychological horror elements. What actually happens in the game outside the hallucinations and artsy moments is way more horrific. They should have played it straight. I completely understand why this game is as loved and as praised as it is, but I honestly think the game is still very overrated. A lot of what this game does shittily, it gets away with because the subject matter is so dark and serious and personal to so many people. It feels kind of manipulative. I've seen a lot of games that also are about really serious subject matter that frankly do a lot wrong, but have their flaws brushed off and shielded from criticism because of that. And to be clear, I'm not accusing Wrong Order of doing that at all. What I'm describing is more something I've noticed with the community around Mouthwashing and the critical reception I've seen to the game. At the end of the day, Mouthwashing is a game with an extremely dark, realistic, and serious subject matter, with a message behind it that is poignant and important for people to broadly understand. That these kinds of narcissistic and selfish monsters are real and out there, and selfish companies who don't give a shit about their workers and only care about making more money enable them to abuse and victimize innocent people. And more importantly, that even well-intentioned people can become part of the problem by inaction, forced upon them by circumstances outside of their control. And honestly, I think that message was muddied and diluted by the creative choices to make the game to a gore fest full of jump scares and cheap horror cliches. And a dire consequence of those creative choices is that, in my opinion, a lot of people ended up seeing this game as just like any other random horror game, which led to what I think just might be the worst fandom for an indie game that I have ever seen. Oh yeah, we're going there. It's time to talk about the... Good God, the Mouthwashing fandom is so bad. It's like really bad. So let's just go through a few examples. Have you guys heard of hood washing? Have you guys heard of hood washing?
Fuck, man. This phone about strong as fuck, twin. Get that shit to your goofy ass school, little. Oh god, that vent is off limits. It's collapsed as a motherfucker inside.
Dude, I swear to God, one of the first posts I've ever seen on r/mouthwashing was just someone complaining about hood washing. What the fuck is hood washing? What is this shit? And there's like... Dude, I swear to God, this game has shipping wars. Like, yeah, let's take the characters that have, like, really toxic dynamics and make them ship. Like, yeah, do your shipping. I don't like that. Yeah, whatever. But, like, bro, I've seen some really bad ships. Have you guys seen the lobotomy? The Jimmy lobotomy ship with fucking pregnancy. What the fuck? Why are we doing pregnancy, like, pregnancy memes with a game about a character being forced to get pregnant? Like, what are we doing? What the fuck? Oh, my fucking head hurts. I think a big part of why the fandom is so bad is because the game is simultaneously so serious and dark, but also has these lovable and iconic cartoony characters that suffer a shit ton, which is basically always the formula for making a huge crazy fandom. I mean, what, we got Undertale, FNAF, DDLC, Welcome Home, Dream SMP, and I think that by taking what should have been a serious psychological drama with dark themes and turning it into this, like, gore-fest horror mascot game, it attracted an audience that came for that kind of generic horror, ended up with really serious shit about rape and abortion, and as a result, we got a fandom that unironically makes posts about how they want to get characters pregnant in a game where the literal worst thing that happens is a character is forced to become pregnant. I don't blame the devs for this because people on the internet are fucking insane. Like, this would happen anyway. Like, I doubt anyone could have realized that Mouthwashing fans would be this bad when the demo came out, but that's just how it is. I mean, like, I don't know. Most of the fandom I've found is, like, really, really chill and, like, is, like, aware of, like, these bad actors. And obviously, as is the case with most fandoms, it's the vocal minority that is causing all the issues. But I still think this is worth pointing out. Okay, enough about that. Let's just get back to the main point of the video. In conclusion, well, Mouthwashing is a bad video game. It's really overrated, but at the same time, I love Mouthwashing. I believe that Mouthwashing is a fantastic story with a lot of problems, and I do think that this game is really overrated, and I think that belief leads me to something I think is very much worth considering. Does Mouthwashing deserve all the praise it's gotten? Probably a lot of it. The thing is, I'm always going to be charitable to indie games that are clearly trying to be genuine pieces of art that are trying to break the mold and do something unique and send a message that needs to be heard. Mouthwashing isn't some AAA billion-dollar AI-generated slop. Like, the fact that it genuinely does things most other games are even afraid to try to do is worth commending. I mean, how many games do you know that tackle subjects of rape, abortion, workplace abuse, and so much more, and do it in a way that's actually mindful and, like, well done? This game, for the most part, doesn't use its shocking subject matter in an abusive way. It's not just, sexual violence, are you scared yet? It takes a really deep look into the psyche of an abuser and the environment that can enable said abuser to get away with the most heinous acts a person can possibly commit. Like, if you want a TLDR of Mouthwashing's main message, it's that capitalism causes rape, and frankly, there isn't much of a difference between a selfish company that only exists to make money and a selfish man that only exists to get fulfillment out of taking advantage of others. You're really not going to see a message like that that's that poignant from a billion-dollar gaming titan anymore. And Mouthwashing's success proves that this is the kind of thing that people want, that the gaming industry needs. At the same time, I think this game does a lot wrong. I think in some aspects it's lazy, and in others it's derivative and cliche, and those flaws shouldn't be excused just because the story is good. This is something I also fall victim to pretty often, where I excuse gameplay and other qualities of games that just aren't all there because the story is so good. And while it's fine to make a game where the focus isn't just on the gameplay, I think good stories ought to take advantage of the medium of gaming to enhance the story and make the message more impactful. That is ultimately the reason why I made this video. I mean, apart from the fact that it's a really eye-catching thumbnail and the title that might get me a lot of views, I'm making this video because I think that this game does have problems that should be addressed and talked about. And frankly, the only place I've ever seen real critique of this game is like the negative reviews on Steam. Don't read the negative reviews on Mouthwashing on Steam, by the way. I know media literacy is dead and all, but like, Jesus, some of these reviews made me actually lose faith in humanity. Like, what the fuck, man? So I hope that this video can spark some more nuanced discussion about Mouthwashing, separate from just calling it a masterpiece of psychological horror over and over and over again. Like I mentioned before, this game did have a big impact on me, and it really took me a long time to articulate why exactly I felt this way about the game. So I hope it's clear that this video isn't just some contrarian blind hatred of the game, and I hope that you all think my criticism of Mouthwashing is reasonable. Whether you see exactly where I'm coming from and totally agree with what I had to say, or you completely disagree with me and think I'm totally wrong, I would love to hear what you think. So please do leave a comment. I always read all the comments, and if you have actual points of disagreement against me, please tell me. I really, really want to read them, and please let me know what you think. But regardless, thank you all so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We're really close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, and I would love to hit that goal, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. So, with all that said, thanks for sticking around, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye-bye!
I say